I never thought I'd become the kind of person who checks his phone before he even gets out of bed in the morning. Not to check the news, not to answer messages, just to make sure no one's been inside my house while I slept. That's where I am now. That's what this did to me. My name is Walter Finch. I'm 52 years old, and I've been a railroad conductor for Union Pacific for going on 24 years. I run the overnight freight corridor between Salt Lake City and Denver, which means I'm gone anywhere from 8 to 14 days at a stretch depending on the schedule. Then home for 4 or 5 before I turn around and do it again. It's not a life that suits everyone. My brother thinks I'm half crazy for it. My ex-wife, who I'll just call my ex-wife because she deserves her privacy even now, thought so too, eventually. We split 7 years ago. The marriage lasted 9. She said I was more committed to the rails than I ever was to her, and I can't honestly say she was wrong. After the divorce, I bought a house in a quiet part of Murray, Utah, a 3-bedroom ranch style with a detached garage and a backyard that backs up to a greenbelt. Nothing fancy, just a place I could come home to between runs. I kept it simple on purpose. I didn't want a house that demanded too much of me when I was there, because I was never there long enough to give it much. For 6 years, that arrangement worked fine. Then one Thursday afternoon in early March, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize while I was sitting in the crew lounge in Grand Junction, waiting for my return assignment. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. It was a woman from the utility company. She introduced herself as a customer care specialist, which I've learned is what they call people who have to deliver bad news politely. She told me my account had flagged for abnormal usage. My gas and electric bill for the previous 2 months had climbed to nearly 4 times my typical average. She wanted to make sure I was aware and to ask if there had been any changes to the property, renovations, additional occupants, new appliances. I told her there hadn't. I told her I lived alone and I'd been on the road for 11 of the last 14 days. She paused. Then she said, very carefully, that she wasn't in a position to speculate about causes, but that if I hadn't made any changes and the usage was this elevated, I might want to have someone physically check the property. I thanked her and hung up. My first thought was a gas leak, something left running, a water heater going haywire, a thermostat stuck on high. Those were the sensible explanations. I called the neighbor on my left, a retired school teacher I'll call my neighbor, and asked if she'd noticed anything unusual at my place. She said the house looked fine from the outside, but now that I mentioned it, she had seen a car parked in my driveway a few times over the past few weeks. A dark SUV, she thought. She'd assumed it was a friend of mine or someone doing work on the place. I don't have friends who drop by. I hadn't hired anyone to do any work. I called my property management company. I use a local outfit I'd hired specifically to do quarterly walkthroughs and handle any minor maintenance while I was on the road. They had a spare key. I'd given it to them 2 years prior when a pipe had burst while I was in Nevada and I needed someone who could get inside fast. The man I spoke with said there'd been no scheduled visits recently and, as far as he knew, no one from his team had been to my property. As far as he knew, I'd finished my assignment and dead-headed home 2 days early. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I parked 2 streets over and walked. It was a Tuesday evening, just past 7, still light enough to see clearly. My house looked exactly the way I'd left it. The front blinds were closed. The porch light was off. I stood across the street for a few minutes, just watching. Nothing moved. Then I walked around to the back through the greenbelt, the way I sometimes come in when I don't want to drag my bag around the front. The gate to my backyard was unlocked. I always lock that gate, always. I've done it out of habit for 6 years without thinking about it. I stood there with my hand on the latch for a long moment. Then I went inside to the back door with my key, moving quietly without entirely understanding why. The kitchen was the first thing I noticed. There was a dish rack next to the sink with 2 plates and a glass in it. I own exactly 1 set of plates and they were sitting in my cabinet where I'd left them. These were different. A white ceramic pattern I didn't recognize. Someone else's dishes, drying in my kitchen. I stood there looking at them like they were something from another planet. The living room was subtle but wrong. My couch pillows were stacked differently. The throw blanket I keep folded over the arm of the chair was bunched up on the cushion like someone had been using it. The TV remote was on the coffee table instead of on the shelf where I always put it. I checked the spare bedroom. The bed was made, but not the way I leave it. Someone had slept in it. The covers were tucked in at the bottom with a kind of care that wasn't mine. There was a faint smell of a cologne or body wash I didn't own. Then I looked in the bathroom. There was a toothbrush in the holder, a shampoo bottle on the edge of the tub I'd never bought, a towel folded on the rack that wasn't from my linen closet. I went back out to the kitchen and sat down at the table. I'm not a man who panics easily. You can't be, in this job. 30 tons of freight at 50 miles an hour teaches you to think before you react. So I sat there and I thought, someone had a key. Someone had access. And whoever it was, they were careful. The dishes were washed. The bed was made. They weren't trashing the place. They were living in it, quietly and neatly, as if they were trying very hard not to be noticed. That scared me more than a broken window would have. I didn't confront anyone. There was no one to confront. I walked through the house one more time to make sure I was alone, and then I left. I locked the back gate behind me, though I understood by then that it didn't mean much. I got a room in a motel off the highway, and I sat on the edge of the bed and made a list of what I knew, which wasn't much, and what I needed to know, which was everything. The next morning, I was at a home improvement store when it opened. I bought 4 cameras, the kind that connect to an app and store footage in the cloud. I spent 3 hours inside my house that afternoon while I was certain the place was empty, mounting them carefully. One in the living room behind a row of books on the shelf, angled toward the front door, one in the kitchen above the refrigerator, one in the hallway. One is a doorbell camera over the front entrance. I set up motion alerts on my phone, put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and I left again. I want to be clear about why I didn't just change the locks. I thought about it. It was my first instinct. But the problem was that if I changed the locks, whoever this was would know they'd been discovered, and I'd never find out who they were or how they'd gotten in. And something about the precision of it, the cleanness, the fact that they knew my schedule, told me this wasn't random. This was someone who had information. I needed to know where that information came from before I could feel safe again. Changing a lock wouldn't fix that. I checked into a hotel and I watched. The first alert came at 4:52 the following afternoon. The doorbell camera caught a man approaching on foot from the street. He was somewhere in his early 40s, medium build, wearing a fleece jacket and carrying a canvas grocery bag. He walked up to my front door with the easy, unhurried competence of someone who had every right to be there. He pulled out a key. He let himself in. I watched through the app as he moved through my house. He put the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and started unpacking it. He turned on the kitchen light and the TV in the living room. He sat down on my couch and took off his shoes. He looked completely at home. I documented everything. I recorded his face from multiple angles. Over the next 4 days, I watched him come and go. He arrived each afternoon between 4 and 6, always on foot or in the dark SUV my neighbor had described. He cooked dinner using my pans. He watched TV. He used my bathroom. He slept in the spare bedroom every night. Never the master. Whoever he was, he had some kind of boundary about that, which I found darkly interesting. On the 3rd day, someone else appeared. A woman arrived at 6 in the evening. She knocked, which was the first thing that told me she didn't have a key. The man answered, and they spoke briefly at the door before he let her in. She was carrying a laptop bag and a large tote. They went to my kitchen table and spread out papers. I could see her screen from the camera angle, not clearly enough to read, but clearly enough to see a real estate-style header on one of the documents. I took screenshots of everything. An hour later, as she was leaving, I managed to capture part of their conversation through the doorbell camera microphone. She said something about a booking coming in for the following weekend. He said he'd handle the check-in. She told him to make sure the place was clean before then. I almost called the police right there, but I made myself wait. That night I searched my address on every short-term rental platform I could think of. I found it on the 3rd one. My house, listed under a name that wasn't mine. The photos were my living room, my kitchen, my backyard with the green belt visible behind the fence. The description called it a peaceful retreat in a quiet residential neighborhood, walking distance to parks and trails. $79 a night for the room, with a 3-night minimum. There were 11 reviews, all 5 stars. The oldest one was dated 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks. This had been going on for 8 weeks while I was running freight between states and sleeping in crew quarters and thinking my house was sitting empty and fine. I went back through the reviews slowly, One guest said the host was very responsive and flexible with check-in time. Another said the neighborhood was quiet and they'd felt completely safe. One review said the room had everything they needed, very clean, felt like a local home. My home. My room. My neighborhood. I found the listing profile. The host name was a first name I didn't recognize, paired with a generic, local handle. The profile photo was a stock image of a city skyline, but there was a contact number linked to the account, and when I searched that number, it came back to a property services company registered in Utah. I searched the company name. It had 2 employees listed in a business directory, the owner, and one other name, a field services coordinator. I searched the second name. The face that came up in a LinkedIn profile was the man I'd been watching on my cameras for 4 days. His name was Raymond Stokes. According to his profile, he had 7 years of experience in short-term rental management and property services. He listed several companies he'd worked with. One of them was my property management company. Not current, according to the dates. He left about 14 months ago. But he'd been there long enough. Long enough to have made a copy of my key. Long enough to know my schedule, which I'd always dutifully shared with the company so they'd know when to expect me home and when the property would be vacant. I sat with that for a long time. The woman with the laptop turned out to be easier to identify than I expected. The listing on the rental platform had been running long enough to have some digital footprint, and when I traced the listing back through some of the guest reviews, one of them mentioned contacting the co-host for support. I found a cached profile page that was no longer active, with a photo that matched the woman from my kitchen table. Her name was Phoebe Alden. She had a small marketing and operations consultancy, and buried in her professional portfolio, still visible through a cache page, was a case study about a short-term rental brand she'd helped launch. The property photos in the case study were of my backyard. She'd written about developing the listing copy, pricing strategy, and guest communication templates. She had built an entire business case study around renting out my house without my knowledge. I went to the police on a Friday morning, 9 days after I'd first mounted the cameras. I brought everything. I brought printed screenshots of the listing, the reviews, the profile pages. I brought screenshots of Raymond Stokes entering my home from the doorbell camera. I brought a log I'd kept of every entry, every departure, timestamps for all of it. I brought photos of the dishes and toothbrush and towel. I had a folder of documentation that was 2 inches thick. The detective assigned to the case was a compact, methodical man in his 50s, who reminded me a little of the kind of engineers I work alongside. He went through everything without expression, asking occasional quiet questions. At the end, he told me that what I brought him was unusually complete. He said usually in cases like this, people came in angry and empty-handed. He said the documentation I had would make his job significantly easier. He asked me if I had any reason to believe other properties were involved. I told him about what I'd found in Phoebe Alden's portfolio. I told him I suspected my property wasn't the only one. He wrote that down carefully and said they'd look into it. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation moved faster than I expected. The detective contacted me twice with follow-up questions about the property management company and the timeline of when Raymond had worked there. I found out later that Raymond, when confronted, had tried to claim the arrangement was informal and above board, that he'd thought the owner had given some kind of standing permission. He hadn't expected there to be camera footage. He definitely hadn't expected there to be 11 weeks of it. The search warrant on Phoebe's laptop turned up everything. Booking records, payment history, a shared operational spreadsheet she and Raymond used to manage scheduling and guest communications. My property was listed in the spreadsheet under a code name, along with 4 others. The operational notes included my typical schedule, key pickup and return protocols, and a note that the property was low risk because the owner traveled for extended periods. Low risk. That's what I was to them. A low-risk asset. The 4 other properties were tracked down. 3 of them were owned by people who, like me, traveled frequently for work. One was owned by an older woman who spent winters in Arizona and hadn't been back to Utah since November. She'd had no idea. None of them had. Raymond Stokes was charged with burglary, fraud, and theft of services. Phoebe Alden was charged with fraud and conspiracy. Both were arrested on a Wednesday morning, which I know because the detective called me and told me. He didn't have to do that, but he did, and I appreciated it more than I could say. Raymond's defense attorney tried to argue that since there'd been no forced entry and the property hadn't been damaged, the burglary charge was an overreach. The judge was not persuaded. The law in Utah is clear. Unauthorized entry with the intent to use or occupy property is burglary, regardless of how the entry was achieved or whether anything is broken. Having a copy key doesn't make it yours. Raymond got 18 months, suspended to time served in probation, with a requirement to pay restitution to all 5 property owners. Phoebe got 12 months probation and restitution. The property management company was investigated separately. The owner claimed no knowledge of Raymond's side operation, which may have been technically true, but the civil suit I joined with the other property owners found them negligent in their key management protocols. We settled out of court. I won't share the amount, but it covered my losses and then some. I never went back to that house. I know that sounds extreme. I know some people would say I was letting them win by leaving. But I want to be honest about what it felt like to walk back into those rooms after everything came out. I'd stand in my own kitchen and see the dish rack where those white plates had dried. I'd walk down the hall and know that strangers had walked it dozens of times. That someone had slept in my spare room while guests I'd never meet had paid for the privilege. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a place that had been borrowed without permission for so long that I'd lost the sense of what it meant for it to be mine. I sold it 8 months later. I bought a condo in a building with a doorman and a key fob system that logs every entry and exit. I have cameras inside and outside. My neighbors know my name and I know theirs. I gave the doorman a list of the 2 people authorized to enter my unit in an emergency. I still run the Salt Lake to Denver corridor. I'm still gone more days than I'm home. That part of my life hasn't changed, and I don't expect it to. But everything around that absence is different now. Here's what I'd tell anyone who travels for work and owns property. The spare key you give a service company doesn't stay in one place. It passes through hands. It goes into lockboxes and key cabinets and coat pockets. People leave jobs, and sometimes they don't return the things they were trusted with. You don't know who has access to your home. You think you do, but you don't. Check your utility bills every single month, not just at the end of the year when you're filing taxes. Every month, a sudden spike in a bill that should be low for a property that should be empty is telling you something. It told me something. I just wish I'd noticed before the utility company had to call me. Search your address on rental platforms. I know it seems unthinkable. It would have seemed unthinkable to me too a year before it happened. Do it anyway. Verbo, Airbnb, Furnish Finder, all of them. Search your street address. If something comes up that you didn't put there, you have a problem you need to act on immediately. Install cameras, not because you distrust the world, but because a camera is the only thing that turns "I think something is wrong" into "here is proof of exactly what is wrong." When I walked into the detective's office with 11 weeks of timestamp footage, the case was essentially made before he asked a single question. Without that footage, I would have had a suspicion and a toothbrush that wasn't mine. That's not enough. When you give keys or access codes to service companies, ask them in writing what their key management policy is. Ask them who specifically will have access and whether keys are ever duplicated. If they can't answer those questions clearly, find someone else. And finally, trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Don't rationalize it away. I stood at my back gate and felt that something was off before I even saw the dish rack. That instinct was right. It's almost always right. The problem is, we've all been trained to second-guess it, to not make a fuss, to assume there's a reasonable explanation. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes the gate being unlocked means exactly what you think it means. I'm not someone who talks about things like this easily. I'm a private person. I've always kept my own counsel, but I've spoken to 3 of the other property owners this situation connected me to, and every one of them said the same thing. They felt stupid for not noticing sooner. I want to be clear that's the wrong feeling. The right feeling is anger, because this was done to us deliberately by people who calculated that we wouldn't notice. They were counting on our absence, our trust, our assumption that the systems we'd put in place to protect our homes were sufficient. They weren't. That's not on us. That's on them. Raymond Stokes is out on probation now. I don't know where he is, and I don't think about him much anymore. What I think about, when I let myself, is what it felt like the first night I came back to an empty house after the sale closed. I drove past my old street. The lights were on inside. New owners, I'd been told. A young couple. The front blinds were open, and I could see warm light spilling out into the yard. It looked like a home. Someone's home. I kept driving. I've had a lot of time on the rails to think about what Raymond Stokes and Phoebe Alden actually did, not just the legal definition of it, not the charges or the restitution amounts. What they actually did, they looked at the shape of my life. A man who's away more than he's home, who trusts quietly and asks few questions. And they decided that shape was an opportunity. They didn't stumble into it. They planned it. They built a spreadsheet. They wrote operational notes. They labeled my home low risk and moved on to the next one. That word has stayed with me. Low risk. It means they calculated that I wouldn't notice, wouldn't react, wouldn't fight back. And for 11 weeks they were right. That's the part I've had to sit with, honestly. What I know now is that what happened to me wasn't bad luck. It was the direct result of a chain of choices, mine and theirs. I trusted a system without verifying it. I handed over a key and a schedule and assumed that information would stay contained. It didn't. Raymond left that company and took what he knew with him, and because no one tracked what he'd had access to, no one noticed the gap he left behind. Every piece of that was a cause. My house being used as a rental listing for 11 weeks was the effect. That's not fate. That's just how things work when accountability is missing from a system that should have it. I'm not saying I deserved what happened. I'm saying it had a logic, and understanding that logic is what let me make sure it couldn't happen again. That's what intelligence actually looks like in practice, I think. Not avoiding every bad thing. Tracing what went wrong clearly enough that you close the specific door it came through. What I'm proud of, looking back, is that I didn't let anger make me stupid. When I stood in my kitchen and saw those dishes, I wanted to call someone, confront someone, do something loud and immediate. I didn't. I thought about what I actually needed, which was proof, not just the satisfaction of a confrontation. I bought cameras. I documented everything. I waited 9 days. That patience cost me something. 9 more days of strangers cycling through my house. But it bought me a 2-inch folder of evidence that made the detective's job straightforward and made Raymond's defense collapse before it started. Phoebe built a case study out of my home and published it on her professional website. She thought it was a credential. It became the thing that confirmed her role in the scheme. Raymond thought 11 weeks of careful, clean behavior made him invisible. The cameras caught every minute of it. What they believed would protect them was exactly what undid them. That's not poetic justice. That's just the way it goes when people who rely on not being seen get seen. I think about the other 4 property owners sometimes, people I've never met who were running the same calculation I was. Trust the company, share the schedule, assume the lock holds. None of us were careless exactly. We were just operating on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. The difference between us and Raymond is that when we found out we were wrong, we changed. He built a business model on hoping we wouldn't. Your home is not just an investment or a structure you return to between obligations. It's the one place that's supposed to hold still while everything else moves. When someone takes that and turns it into a transaction, the loss isn't really about the utility bills or the cost of new locks. It's about the feeling of walking into a room and knowing, for certain, that it belongs to you. I had to rebuild that feeling from scratch. I did rebuild it. That took longer than the legal case, and nobody helped me with it. But it's done. If anything I've told you makes you want to check something, a bill, an address on a rental site, a key you gave to someone 2 years ago, do it tonight. Not because something is probably wrong, because knowing for certain that it isn't is worth 10 minutes of your time.